Normandy, France, July 18, 1944. So 3:47 hours. Oberstabsarzt Klaus Bergmann's hand stopped mid-suture, not because of exhaustion, though he hadn't slept in 38 hours, but because of what he was seeing through the canvas opening of the American field hospital where he now worked as a prisoner of war. Bright, impossibly bright, surgical lights powered by generators that never seemed to run out of fuel, casting shadowless illumination across 4 operating tables running simultaneously, steam rising from an autoclave here 5 kilometers from the front line, sterilizing instruments between procedures. And the smell, not the familiar stench of gangrene and death that had defined his last 6 months in Wehrmacht field hospitals, but the sharp, clean scent of ether and disinfectant. He had been taught that Americans were soft, disorganized, incapable of sustaining the brutal efficiency required by modern warfare. The Reich's propaganda had been clear. These were the descendants of merchants and Hollywood dreamers, playing at soldiers bound to collapse under the weight of real combat medicine. Instead, he was standing in what he would later describe in his POW debriefing as a factory for saving lives, watching American surgeons save men with wounds he had been trained to classify as hoffnungslos, hopeless, the confession that would break him, that would break dozens of captured German medical officers, wasn't extracted through interrogation. It came out as a whisper to a fellow prisoner 3 days later. Es ist schlimmer für uns im Hinterland. It's worse for us in the rear. Their permanent hospitals in occupied France, their sophisticated university clinics back in Germany, all of them inferior to this temporary American tent city, erected in a muddy Norman field in a matter of hours. This is the story of how an entire generation of German military surgeons, raised on the doctrine of Teutonic superiority and scientific excellence, confronted the devastating reality that they had been surpassed, not by better doctors or superior technique, but by something far more humiliating, better logistics, better resources, better systems. The revelation would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Berlin, Friedrich Wilhelms Universität, September 1938. Klaus Bergmann was 26 years old when Professor Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbruch placed a hand on his shoulder and declared him ready for military service. The great Sauerbruch, pioneer of thoracic surgery, holder of the Iron Cross from the previous war, architect of German military medicine, did not give such endorsements lightly. "You are entering service at a time when German medicine stands unchallenged," Sauerbruch told the assembled class of new military surgeons. Behind him, photographs of spotless operating theaters and neat rows of wounded soldiers testified to the efficiency of the Wehrmacht medical system. "We have learned from the mistakes of 1914. We have systematized, rationalized, perfected." The lecture hall smelled of floor polish and ambition. 43 young doctors sat in pressed uniforms, notebooks open, pens ready to transcribe the wisdom of the master. Bergmann wrote down every word. "The Americans," Sauerbruch continued, his voice carrying the contempt of someone who had never lost a professional argument, "remain trapped in their provincial empiricism. They have resources, yes, the resources of a nation that has never known true sacrifice, but they lack Gründlichkeit. They lack thoroughness. They lack the philosophical foundation that has made German medical science the envy of the world. It was not propaganda. Not exactly. It was the sincere belief of men who had built their careers on genuine achievements. German contributions to medicine were undeniable: antiseptic surgery, bacteriology, cellular pathology, modern pharmacology. The names were a litany of triumph: Koch, Virchow, Ehrlich, Röntgen. 4 Nobel Prizes in medicine or physiology between 1901 and 1910. German medical journals were the gold standard. German techniques were copied in London, Paris, even New York. Bergmann believed because the evidence seemed overwhelming. When he received his posting to a Wehrmacht surgical unit in 1939, he carried with him not just his instruments and textbooks, but an unshakable conviction that he represented the pinnacle of medical evolution. Poland, October 1939. The Polish campaign introduced him to field medicine. The Wehrmacht medical system operated with clockwork precision. Wounded soldiers were evacuated through a carefully organized chain, from Truppenverbenplatz, battalion aid station, to Hauptverbenplatz, main dressing station, to field hospitals in the rear. Serious cases were transported to base hospitals in Germany itself. It worked. The system worked brilliantly, as long as the variables remained favorable, as long as fuel was plentiful, as long as roads were intact, as long as the campaigns remained short and victorious. Bergmann performed his first amputation in a brick schoolhouse in Łódź. The patient, a 20-year-old Gefreiter with a shattered femur, survived the procedure. The operation was performed on a wooden table under electric lights powered by the city's grid. Instruments were sterilized in a proper autoclave. Post-operative recovery occurred in clean beds with adequate morphine supplies. Efficient, Bergmann noted in his journal that night. The system validates itself. France, May-June 1940. The French campaign was even easier. The Wehrmacht swept across France in 6 weeks. Medical casualties were light. The evacuation system had time to function optimally. Bergmann was stationed in a commandeered hospital in Reims, a real hospital with real equipment, real supplies. He performed 42 operations in 3 weeks. Survival rate, 87%. "We are succeeding," he wrote to his wife, Anna, "because we are organized, because we have eliminated chaos through systematic preparation. The French fight bravely, but their medical system is antiquated. The wounded lie for hours in church basements. Their surgeons operate with instruments from the last century. It is, sadly, no contest." There was no arrogance in these words, only the calm assessment of a professional observing his competitors' failures. Russia, December 1941. The Eastern Front changed everything. The cold arrived like a physical enemy, attacking not just men, but the entire infrastructure of warfare. Ambulances wouldn't start. Blood plasma froze solid in its containers. Wounded men died of exposure before they could be evacuated. The careful chain of evacuation stretched beyond breaking, 600 kilometers from the front lines back to hospitals in Poland, then another 1,000 kilometers to Germany. Bergmann's field hospital was established in a commandeered school in Vyazma. No running water, no electricity. Heat came from wood-burning stoves that consumed precious fuel. The autoclave sat unused. Boiling instruments in pots over open flames became the standard. Morphine supplies ran low, then ran out. Wounded men screamed through amputations with nothing but vodka and leather straps to bite. The survival rate dropped to 42%. "It is the conditions," Bergmann wrote, to himself now, not to Anna, because mail service had collapsed. "The system remains sound. The conditions have become impossible." He needed to believe this. The alternative, that the system itself was flawed, that German organizational genius had failed to account for the chaos of real war, was unthinkable. France, September 1943. The reassignment to France felt like resurrection. After 22 months in Russia, where he had lost 37 pounds, and most of his illusions about the invincibility of German planning, France represented a return to civilization, to proper hospitals, to a functioning supply chain. Bergmann was posted to a Wehrmacht hospital in Caen, established in a former tuberculosis sanatorium, real beds, real operating theaters, a genuine autoclave, functional and used daily. Adequate supplies of morphine, ether, plasma, bandages. The survival rate climbed back to 73%. "We are again ourselves," he wrote in his journal. "Russia was an aberration. Here, with proper resources, the system functions as designed." But even in France, cracks were showing. Allied bombing raids disrupted supply lines. Fuel became precious. Experienced surgeons were pulled away to the Eastern Front, replaced by younger, less trained men. Equipment began to age without replacement. The autoclave in Caen broke in March 1944 and remained broken. Parts were unavailable. Still, Bergmann told himself the situation remained manageable. The system was under stress but holding. German thoroughness would prevail. Normandy, June 7, 1944. Day 2 of the invasion. The Allied landing transformed everything overnight. Bergmann's hospital in Caen was suddenly 40 kilometers from an active combat zone. Wounded arrived in overwhelming numbers. 200 in the first 24 hours, then 300, then numbers stopped meaning anything. Men on stretchers filled every hallway. Others lay on the floor. The operating theaters ran 24 hours, surgeons working until they collapsed, then being shaken awake for the next case. Supplies vanished. By June 10th, morphine was reserved only for amputations. Plasma was gone. Bandages were washed and reused. The blood on the floor was mopped up and the mop used again. Gangrene and infection became more lethal than the original wounds. On June 15th, with British forces 3 kilometers from Caen, evacuation orders arrived. The hospital was to be abandoned. Patients who could walk were to move themselves. Those who couldn't would be left for the enemy. Bergman remained behind with 6 other doctors and 23 nurses, volunteering to stay with the 300 wounded who couldn't be moved. It was a practical decision. These men would die without medical care, and someone had to explain the surrender to the British. The British didn't arrive. The Americans did. June 17, 1944. 1,420 hours. The first Americans through the door were not combat troops, but medical personnel. 4 soldiers wearing brassards marked with red crosses, led by a captain who introduced himself as Walker Auxiliary Surgical Group. Captain James Walker was 31 years old, a graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School, and possessed the kind of casual confidence that came from never having doubted his tools or training. He surveyed the blood-soaked hallways of the Caen Hospital for perhaps 90 seconds before speaking. "We're setting up a field hospital outside the city," he said in English. A corporal translated into passable German. "You and your staff will assist. Your wounded will be evacuated as soon as we have transport. Any questions?" Bergman had expected interrogation, imprisonment, perhaps a bullet. The propaganda had been clear about Allied brutality toward captured German medical personnel. Instead, he was being conscripted. "I am a prisoner," he managed to say. "You're a doctor," Walker replied. "We've got 500 wounded coming in the next 12 hours. You can sulk about being captured, or you can help save lives. Your choice." June 18, 1944. So 300 hours. The American field hospital materialized like something from a fever dream. At 1800 hours the previous evening, the site had been an empty meadow 2 kilometers northwest of Caen. By midnight, it was a functional medical complex, 16 large tents erected in precise rows, generators humming, surgical lights blazing, supply trucks unloading in continuous rotation. Bergman watched this transformation from the back of an American truck, hands unbound, sitting next to 2 Wehrmacht nurses who stared at the scene with the same incomprehension he felt. "How?" one of the nurses whispered. "How is this possible?" The truck stopped. An American sergeant helped them down, helped, not shoved, and directed them toward the largest tent. "Surgical 1, the sergeant said. "Captain Walker's waiting." Inside, Bergman stopped walking. The tent was 40 feet long and 25 feet wide. Canvas walls, yes, but everything else belonged in a permanent hospital. 6 operating tables arranged in 2 rows. Surgical lights suspended from aluminum frames, powered by cables running to generators outside. Instrument trays on wheeled carts. An autoclave, an actual autoclave hissing with steam against the far wall. Oxygen tanks lined up like soldiers. Blood plasma hanging from IV stands. The smell of antiseptic so strong it burned the nostrils. And the organization. Everything labeled, everything in its place. Instruments laid out in perfect sequence, supply crates stacked with visible inventory tags, a wooden board listing the surgical schedule, 4 teams, 6-hour shifts, no gaps. Captain Walker was scrubbing at a portable sink, his back to the entrance. "Bergman?" he called without turning around. "That you?" "Yes." Bergman's voice came out strange, distant. "Good. Scrub in. We've got a sucking chest wound on table 2, needs immediate attention. You done thoracic surgery?" Yes, many times." "Great. Glove up. Miller will assist you." Walker glanced over his shoulder, smiled, actually smiled as if they were colleagues at a university hospital rather than enemies in a war zone. "Welcome to the 47th Mobile." Bergman walked to the scrub sink like a man underwater. His hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual: soap, brush, nails between the fingers, 30 seconds minimum. But his mind was disconnected, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. Americans were disorganized. Americans were inefficient. Americans couldn't sustain complex operations under field conditions. The patient on table 2 was a 19-year-old GI from Kansas with a sucking chest wound from shell fragments. The American anesthesiologist, a cheerful lieutenant named Kowalski, had already intubated him and started the ether. The wound was exposed, cleaned, ready for surgery. "All yours, Doc," Miller said. He was perhaps 25, with the confident hands of someone who had assisted in hundreds of operations. "Need anything, just holler." Bergman made the first incision. The instruments were sharp, properly sterilized, the right instruments, in the right sequence, handed to him without asking. The lighting was perfect, shadowless, brilliant, exactly what he needed. The suction worked. The clamps held. The catgut sutures were high quality, not the deteriorating thread he'd been using in Caen. He worked in silence, his mind splitting into two distinct voices. One voice, the surgeon, focused on the technical task, identifying the torn intercostal vessels, clamping them, ligating them, checking for additional damage, ensuring the lung could reinflate. The other voice, the German officer, the student of Sauerbruch, the believer in Teutonic superiority, screamed questions that had no answers. How did they bring an autoclave to a field hospital? Where did they get this much plasma? Why are the generators never running out of fuel? How is this possible? The operation took 47 minutes. The patient's vital signs remained stable throughout. When Bergman tied off the final suture and stepped back, Miller was already preparing the dressing. "Nice work, Doc," Kowalski said, adjusting the ether flow as he began waking the patient. "Clean technique. You trained in Germany?" "Berlin, Friedrich Wilhelms Universität." "No kidding? I did a rotation at Charité Hospital in '38. Beautiful facility. Learned a lot there." The casual tone, two professionals discussing their training, was more disorienting than anything else. Bergman stripped off his gloves, dropped them in a waste bin, a proper waste bin, lined with a disposable bag, and walked outside. Dawn was breaking over Normandy. The field hospital was fully illuminated, every tent glowing from within. Wounded were being unloaded from ambulances in steady streams. Other surgical tents were already operating. He could see through the canvas walls. Shadow play of surgeons and nurses moving in practiced choreography. And beyond the immediate hospital, supply tents, large as houses, their flaps open to reveal stacks of equipment. A mess tent serving hot food. He could smell coffee, real coffee, and bacon. A generator farm, 6 large machines running in parallel, fuel drums stacked nearby in quantities that would have sustained his entire hospital in Cannes for a month. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Richter, one of the other captured German surgeons, walked up beside him. Richter was 51, a veteran of the previous war, a man not given to emotional displays. He stared at the American complex for a long moment before speaking. "I don't understand," Richter said quietly. "Neither do I." In Russia, we told ourselves it was the conditions, the cold, the distances, the partisan attacks. The system was sound, but the circumstances were impossible. Richter's voice was hollow. Then in France, we told ourselves it was the bombing, the supply disruptions, the retreat. The system was sound, but the situation was chaotic. Yes, but this, Richter gestured at the American hospital. This is a field hospital. They erected this in hours, in the middle of an active combat zone, and it is better, substantially better, than our permanent hospital in Caen. Better than the university hospital in Munich where I trained. Bergman said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was irrefutable. "I think," Richter continued, his voice barely audible, "we were lied to. Or we lied to ourselves. I don't know which is worse." Over the next 11 days, as Bergman worked 18-hour shifts in the American Field Hospital, the evidence accumulated like surgical specimens in jars, each one carefully preserved, impossible to dismiss, collectively devastating. Evidence. Item 1. The system of triage. German military medicine operated on a principle of Schweregrad, severity assessment. The most seriously wounded received priority treatment. This seemed logical, even compassionate, but it led to a bottleneck. Complex cases consumed hours of surgical time, while dozens of moderately wounded men waited, their conditions deteriorating. The Americans used a different system, one that initially seemed callous to Bergman. They divided patients into 4 categories marked with colored tags: black, expectant, too severely wounded to save with available resources, made comfortable given morphine but not operated on; red, immediate, life-threatening but survivable with prompt intervention; yellow, delayed, serious but can wait several hours; green, minor, walking wounded, treated last. On his 3rd day, Bergman watched an American surgeon, Major Helen Fisher, a 42-year-old general surgeon from Philadelphia, walk past a black-tagged patient, a German soldier with massive abdominal trauma, to operate on a yellow-tagged patient, an American GI with a compound leg fracture. "He's dying," Bergman said, pointing to the German soldier. "He needs immediate surgery." Fisher stopped, looked at the patient, looked at Bergman. Her eyes were tired but not unkind. "He has maybe a 10% chance with surgery. That surgery would take 3 hours. In those 3 hours, I can save 4 other men with 90% survival odds. It's mathematics, not cruelty." We don't abandon patients. We don't either. He's getting morphine, fluids, comfort. But I'm not trading 4 lives for a 10% chance at 1. She paused. "I'm sorry. I know this seems brutal. But at the end of the day, I save more lives this way." The German soldier died 2 hours later, comfortable and pain-free. The 4 patients Fisher operated on that afternoon all survived. Bergman tried to maintain his objection on ethical grounds, but the statistics were undeniable. The American triage system, for all its apparent hardness, resulted in higher overall survival rates. By the end of the first week, the 447th Mobile Hospital had treated 847 patients with a survival rate of 89%. In Caen, with the same number of patients, Bergman's hospital had achieved 53%. Evidence Item 2. The logistics of supply. On June 23rd, Bergman was assigned to work with Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, the hospital's supply officer. Harrison was 26, had never attended medical school, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to conjure necessary items out of apparently thin air. "I don't understand your job," Bergman admitted as they conducted inventory in Supply Tent 3. Harrison grinned. "Nobody does. That's why they pay me the medium bucks." He checked his clipboard. "Okay, we used 1,700 units of plasma last week. Current inventory, 2,300 units. Requisition for 3,000 more goes in today." "You can just requisition 3,000 units?" "Sure, they'll arrive in 4 to 6 days. "From where?" "Depots in England, which got them from depots in the States, which got them from blood banks in every major city." Harrison saw Bergman's expression. "What?" "We ran out of plasma in Caen on June 10th. I requested resupply. I was told there was none available in all of occupied France." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I heard things were tough for you guys." He returned to his inventory. "The thing is, logistics wins wars. Not bravery, not tactics. Logistics. You can have the best surgeons in the world, but if they don't have plasma and morphine and sterile instruments, they're just guys with medical degrees watching people die." That evening, Bergman watched American supply trucks arrive, 6 2.5-ton trucks loaded with medical supplies, food, fuel, and equipment. They arrived on schedule, unloaded in 27 minutes using organized work details, and departed. No drama, no crisis, no shortages. He tried to calculate how many similar deliveries would be required to sustain a German field hospital of comparable size. Then he tried to calculate whether the Wehrmacht even possessed the fuel and vehicles to make such deliveries consistently. He stopped calculating because the answers were too depressing. Evidence. Item 3. The depth of specialization. On June 26th, an American B-17 bomber crew was brought in after their aircraft was shot down near Argentan. The waist gunner, Sergeant Robert Chen, age 22, from San Francisco, had severe burns across 40% of his body. Bergman had treated burns before. The protocol was established. Clean the wounds, apply tannic acid or Vaseline gauze, bandage, administer morphine for pain, and hope infection didn't set in. Survival rate for burns over 30%, approximately 15%. The Americans did something different. Within 30 minutes of Chen's arrival, a specialized burn treatment team arrived from a different unit, the 32nd General Hospital, stationed 15 kilometers away. The team consisted of a burn specialist, Major David Rosen, trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, 2 specialized nurses, and a complete mobile burn treatment unit. Sterile saline solution, sulfadiazine cream, specialized bandages, a portable X-ray machine to check for smoke inhalation damage, and enough plasma to replace Chen's fluid losses for a week. Bergman watched Rosen work. The careful debridement, the application of sulfadiazine, a drug Bergman had read about in American journals but never seen used, the constant monitoring of fluid balance, the attention to preventing infection. "You brought an entire specialized team for one patient?" Bergman asked. "Chen's the 3rd burn case we've treated this week," Rosen replied, not looking up from his work. "We've got teams for burns, for maxillofacial injuries, for neurosurgery, for vascular surgery. Specialization saves lives. We also have specialists, but they work in base hospitals, far from the front." So did ours, until someone realized that moving the specialist to the patient is faster than moving the patient to the specialist. Rosen finished applying the sulfadiazine and began the bandaging. "Besides, with our transport network, I can be anywhere in the theater within 4 hours." Sergeant Chen survived. He spent 3 months in recovery, underwent 4 skin grafts, and eventually returned to the States with severe scarring but full function of his limbs. Bergman thought of the German burn victims he'd treated in Russia. The screaming, the infections, the deaths. Not because German doctors were incompetent, but because they lacked the resources, the drugs, the system that made survival possible. Evidence, item 4, the question of sterility. The issue that haunted Bergman most was sterility. In Caen, after the autoclave broke, he had boiled instruments in pots. This was standard field practice for Wehrmacht medicine. Boiling killed most bacteria, and it was the best available option. But most bacteria was not all bacteria. Infection rates in Caen had climbed to 38%. Many men survived their initial surgery only to die days later from sepsis. The American field hospital had an autoclave. Not a small portable unit, but a full-sized steam sterilizer capable of processing instruments for multiple operating theaters simultaneously. It ran continuously, powered by dedicated generators. On June 28th, Bergman asked Captain Walker the question that had been consuming him. How do you justify bringing an autoclave to a field hospital? The weight, the fuel consumption, the complexity? Walker looked genuinely surprised by the question. How do you justify not bringing one? Every instrument that goes into a patient needs to be sterile. Steam sterilization is the gold standard. Yeah, it's heavy and uses fuel, but what's the alternative? Losing patients to preventable infections. We boil instruments. And your infection rate? Bergman hesitated. In the field, 30 to 40%. Ours is 8%, and half of those are from contamination at the point of injury, not from our procedures. Walker stripped off his gloves. Look, I get it. You're working with what you have. But the whole point of our logistics system is to make sure we have what we need. An autoclave isn't a luxury, it's essential equipment. That night, unable to sleep, Bergman walked through the American hospital compound. It was over 200 hours. 2 of the 4 surgical theaters were still operating. Elective cases could wait, but emergency operations ran around the clock. The autoclave hummed in its tent, tended by a corporal whose sole job was maintaining sterile instrument supply. Bergman did the mathematics in his head. American Field Hospital, 850 patients, 89% survival rate, 8% infection rate. German Hospital in Caen, 850 patients, estimated, 53% survival rate, 38% infection rate. The difference, approximately 300 additional survivors. 300 men who would return to their families, 300 futures that existed because of better logistics, better equipment, better systems, 300 lives that German military medicine, for all its vaunted superiority, had failed to save. July 2, 1944. Officers' mess tent. The American camp had established a separate mess area for POW medical personnel. It wasn't guarded. The Germans had given their parole not to escape, and the Americans accepted this without apparent concern. The arrangement would have been impossible in the Wehrmacht, where prisoners were always secured, always watched. 11 German medical officers ate dinner together, 9 surgeons, 1 anesthesiologist, 1 internist. The food was American rations, Spam, canned beans, white bread, coffee, monotonous but abundant. More food than any of them had seen in months. The conversation started innocuously. Oberstabsarzt Richter asking about surgical techniques for penetrating abdominal wounds, but quickly spiraled into darker territory. "I served in Russia," said Stabsarzt Friedrich Holzer, 43, from Munich. His hand shook slightly as he spoke, a tremor that had started in Stalingrad and never stopped. "We told ourselves the conditions were impossible. Minus 40 degrees, no supplies, roads blocked by partisans. We told ourselves that with proper resources, German medicine was superior." "It was the conditions," someone said half-heartedly. "Was it?" Holzer's voice rose. "Was it really? Because I'm looking at what these Americans have built. In a field, in an active combat zone, in less time than it took us to set up a field hospital in Russia. And I'm asking myself, were the conditions impossible, or were we simply incompetent?" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of generators. Bergman spoke carefully. "The Americans have resources we never possessed, industrial capacity, supply lines that function." "They have priorities," Richter corrected. "They decided that keeping soldiers alive was worth the expense of autoclaves and plasma and specialized surgical teams. They decided that logistics was as important as tactics. We decided that conquest was more important than sustainability." "That's not fair," Stabsarzt Georg Weiss protested. He was 29, the youngest of the group, still trying to hold on to the certainties he'd been taught. "We were fighting on multiple fronts. Resources were scarce. We did the best we could with what we had." "Did we?" Richter's question hung in the air. "I've been thinking about this. The Americans didn't invent the autoclave. We Germans did. We didn't lack the knowledge or the technical capability. We lacked the institutional commitment to prioritize soldier welfare over expansion." "We prioritized victory," Weiss insisted, "and they prioritized survival. Guess which approach leads to better outcomes?" Richter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'm 51 years old. I've been a surgeon for 26 years. I trained at one of the finest universities in the world. And I'm watching American doctors, some of them trained at schools I'd never heard of, achieve results that make my entire career look like a practice run in futility." He walked out. The remaining officers sat in uncomfortable silence. Oberfeldarzt Heinrich Brandt, the internist, finally spoke. He was 63, had served in the previous war, carried himself with the dignity of age and experience. "Gentlemen, I believe we are confronting a truth that is more painful than military defeat. We were wrong about our superiority, not wrong about our training. That was excellent. Not wrong about our dedication. We worked ourselves to exhaustion. We were wrong about our system. We built an ideology around efficiency and thoroughness, but we failed to build the logistical infrastructure that makes efficiency possible." "They have wealth we don't have," someone argued. "They have priorities we didn't choose," Brandt countered. "Wealth is one factor, but organization, systematic planning, institutional commitment to sustainability, these are choices. The Americans chose to build a medical system that could function in field conditions. We chose to build a medical system that looked impressive in peacetime and collapsed under the strain of total war. Bergman thought of Sauerbruch, his mentor, standing in that Berlin lecture hall in 1938. The Americans remained trapped in their provincial empiricism. Empiricism, the careful observation of what actually works rather than what should theoretically work. The Americans had empirically determined that field hospitals needed autoclaves, abundant plasma, specialized surgical teams, and robust supply lines. So they built a system to provide those things. The Germans had theoretically determined that superior training in Teutonic discipline would overcome material limitations, and they had been proven catastrophically wrong. July 7, 1944, post-operative recovery tent. Sergeant Chen, the B-17 gunner with severe burns, was conscious and stable. Bergman had been checking on him daily, partly from medical interest, partly from a need to understand how the American burn treatment protocols achieved their results. "How are you feeling today?" Bergman asked in careful English. "Like I got cooked in an oven and put back together by mad scientists," Chen replied with a weak smile. "But alive. Doc Rosen says I might even keep all my fingers." "That is good. Very good." "You're one of the German docs, right? I heard you guys have been helping out." "Yes, I am. I was Oberstabsarzt, senior staff surgeon." "Well, thanks for the help, Doc. I hear you guys are pretty good at this stuff." The casual gratitude was startling. Bergman had saved this man's enemy, had worked alongside American surgeons to preserve the life of someone actively trying to kill Germans. And Chen's response was simple thanks, as if the nationality of his doctors was irrelevant compared to the competence of their care. "May I ask you something?" Bergman said. "Sure." "Before you were shot down, did you know about American military hospitals? About how they operate?" Chen looked puzzled. "Not really. I mean, I knew we had medics and field hospitals and stuff. Didn't think much about it." "Why?" "I am trying to understand. The level of organization, the equipment, the supplies. Did your government explain to civilians that this was being built?" "I don't think so. I mean, there were war bond drives and production campaigns, arsenal of democracy and all that. But I don't remember anyone specifically talking about medical supplies." Chen shifted carefully in his bed. "Is that weird?" "No, it is very American, I think. You built this enormous, sophisticated system and took it for granted. You didn't celebrate it or propagandize it, because it seemed obvious that wounded soldiers should receive the best possible care." "Well, yeah, obviously." Chen looked genuinely confused that this was even a question. That conversation haunted Bergman for days. The Americans had built their medical system not as propaganda, not as a demonstration of superiority, but as a practical necessity that required no justification. Care for wounded soldiers was simply a baseline expectation, not a luxury to be celebrated. The Germans had celebrated their medical system endlessly, photographs, films, speeches about efficiency and organization, while allowing it to collapse under the weight of its own ideological pretensions. July 12, 1944, Surgical Theater 2. Major Helen Fischer was performing a vascular repair on a German POW, Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt, a 24-year-old infantryman from Hamburg with a severed femoral artery. It was delicate work, requiring microsurgical precision to reconnect the damaged vessel. Bergman was assisting, holding retractors, following Fischer's terse instructions. The operation took 2 hours and 17 minutes. When Fischer tied off the final suture and blood began flowing properly through the repaired artery, she stepped back and nodded with satisfaction. "Good work," she said to the team. Then to Bergman, "You've got steady hands. Ever done vascular repair before?" "Twice. Both times the patient died." "Well, this one's going to live. Want to know why?" Bergman nodded. Fischer pointed to the microscope mounted above the operating table, a piece of equipment Bergman had never seen in a field hospital. "Magnification. Can't reconnect vessels properly if you can't see what you're doing. Also," she indicated the fine surgical sutures, "we've got 6 nil silk specifically designed for vascular work. And the patient's been getting typed and matched blood, not just plasma, so his pressure stayed stable throughout." "We didn't have these resources." I know, I'm not gloating, I'm explaining. Fisher pulled off her gloves. Modern vascular surgery requires specific tools and conditions. Without them, even the best surgeon in the world is going to lose patients. It's not about skill, it's about system. That word again, system. Schmidt survived. 6 weeks later, he was walking with a slight limp but full circulation in his leg, a leg that would have been amputated in any German field hospital if he'd survived the initial injury at all. July 15, 1944, 2300 hours, personal quarters. Bergman lay in his assigned cot. American POWs were housed in tents identical to those used by American medical personnel. Another small shock, and tried to write a letter to Anna. He had written nothing since his capture. The Americans had provided paper, pens, envelopes. Mail would be routed through the Red Cross. He had no excuse except psychological paralysis. What could he say? Dear Anna, I have been captured by the Americans. I am unharmed. I am being treated well, better than well. I am working in their field hospital and discovering that everything we believed was a lie. He couldn't write that. It would never pass censorship, and even if it did, what would Anna think? That her husband had broken? That he had been seduced by enemy propaganda? But it wasn't propaganda. That was the horror of it. Every comparison was observable, measurable, undeniable. He tried again. Dear Anna, I am safe and working as a surgeon in an American medical facility. The conditions are adequate. I think of you constantly and pray for your safety. Adequate. The word was a lie, but it was a lie he could live with. He sealed the envelope without reading it again. Across the tent, Richter was also awake, staring at the canvas ceiling. Are you writing home? Trying to. What are you telling them? Nothing. Everything. I don't know. Bergman set the letter aside. What do you tell someone when your entire worldview has collapsed? You don't. You wait until you've rebuilt something stable and hope you can remember who you were before. Richter sat up. I keep thinking about the Reich propaganda ministry. All those films about German efficiency, German organization, German superiority. And I believed them because I had no comparison. I saw our system working and assumed it was the best possible system because I'd been told we were the best. We were the best in 1938. Were we? Or were we just the best we'd personally experienced? Richter's voice carried the weight of a man reassessing his entire life. I never saw an American hospital before this. I never saw a British hospital. I compared our system to the Russians, the Poles, the French, all of whom we'd defeated, and concluded we were superior. But the comparison was rigged from the start. What do we do with this knowledge? Survive. Remember. Hope that someday we can rebuild our medical system with these lessons in mind. Richter lay back down. If there's anything left to rebuild, after this war ends. July 18, 1944. Dawn. The words came out as a whisper, but they shattered something fundamental in Klaus Bergmann's understanding of himself and his nation, as is schlimmer für uns im Hinterland. It's worse for us in the rear. He was standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside the surgical tent, drinking American coffee, real coffee, not ersatz, abundant enough to be given to prisoners without ration, watching the organized chaos of the night shift transition to the day shift. Richter stood beside him, and the confession was meant for him, but both men knew it was larger than a private admission. It was the acknowledgement that their permanent hospitals, the university clinics, the military hospitals in occupied territories, the sophisticated facilities they had trained in and been proud of, were inferior to this temporary American tent city. How did we not know? Richter asked. We knew. We chose not to see. Bergman took a sip of coffee, bitter and hot and American. Every supply shortage, every broken autoclave, every patient we lost to infection, we explained it away. Russian winter, Allied bombing, fuel shortages. We never asked the fundamental question, why can they sustain their system and we cannot? Because they built their system to be sustained. We built ours to look impressive. It was a damning assessment, and it was accurate. German military medicine had been designed as a showcase, photographs of spotless operating theaters, films of efficient evacuations, statistics carefully selected to demonstrate superiority. But it had been built on assumptions that collapsed under the strain of total war, that campaigns would be short, that resources would remain abundant, that German industrial capacity could support both conquest and sustainability. The Americans had made different assumptions. They assumed long campaigns, extended supply lines, massive casualties. So they built redundancy into every system, multiple supply routes, abundant reserves, equipment designed for field conditions rather than peacetime demonstrations. July 22, 1944. Medical staff meeting. The American hospital held weekly staff meetings, another organizational innovation that impressed the German doctors. Every surgeon, every nurse, every supply officer gathered to review cases, discuss outcomes, identify problems. Colonel Richard Morrison, the hospital's commanding officer, opened the meeting with statistics. Last week, we treated 417 casualties. Survival rate, 87%. Infection rate, 9%. Average time from injury to definitive care, 3 hours and 12 minutes. He continued through the numbers, clinical and precise. Then he addressed the German POW doctors directly. I want to thank our German colleagues for their assistance. Dr. Bergman, your work on the thoracic cases has been exemplary. Dr. Richter, your experience with frost injury has been invaluable. Dr. Holzer, your abdominal techniques are first-rate. The gratitude was genuine, professional, stripped of politics. These were doctors acknowledging other doctors. Then Morrison said something that crystallized everything. Gentlemen, war is a human tragedy, but medicine is a human profession. The oath we take doesn't distinguish between friend and enemy, only between patient and physician. You've honored that oath under circumstances I can barely imagine. That deserves recognition. After the meeting, Bergman approached Morrison. May I ask you a question, Colonel? Of course. Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. We have killed your soldiers. Yet you give us coffee and courtesy and include us in your medical staff. Morrison considered the question carefully. I'm not going to pretend we're friends or that this war isn't real, but you're doctors. You took an oath to heal. So did I. Right now, in this hospital, we're practicing medicine together. That's bigger than the war. This would not happen in a German POW hospital. Maybe. Maybe not. I can't speak to your system. Morrison's expression was neutral. But I can tell you our system. We believe that maintaining professional standards, even with enemies, is part of what separates civilization from barbarism. You're being treated as medical professionals because that's what you are. Bergman returned to his quarters that night and finally finished the letter to Anna. Dear Anna, I am writing from an American field hospital where I have been working since my capture. I am safe and treated well. The work is demanding but important. I have witnessed things that challenge everything I believed about medicine, about efficiency, about our nation's capabilities. I cannot explain in a letter what I have learned, but I will tell you this. When this war ends, and I pray it ends soon, we must rebuild our medical system from the foundation, not restore what we had, but create something new, informed by hard lessons. The Americans have shown me that superiority is not proclaimed. It is demonstrated through results. Our system proclaimed itself superior. Their system saves more lives. That is the only metric that matters. I love you. I think of you constantly. Stay safe. Klaus. He didn't know if the letter would reach her. Germany was collapsing. Cities were being bombed. The postal system was probably in ruins. But he needed to write it, needed to begin the process of articulating what he had learned. August 3, 1944. Operating Theater 4. A young American private, Thomas Mackenzie, age 19, from rural Virginia, was brought in with multiple fragment wounds from a German artillery shell. Shrapnel in his abdomen, his left arm, his chest. Severe but survivable with immediate intervention. Captain Walker assigned the surgery to Bergman. You're lead surgeon, Walker said. I'll assist. Let's see what you can do with proper equipment. The operation took 3 hours. Bergman worked with an intensity that surprised him, not just to save the patient, but to prove something to himself. That with the right tools, the right support, the right system, he was as capable as any American surgeon, removing abdominal shrapnel, repairing torn intestine, ensuring no additional bleeding, closing the chest wound. Throughout the procedure, every instrument he needed appeared in his hand the moment he needed it. The lighting was perfect. The suction worked. The anesthesia remained stable. When he stepped back from the completed surgery, Mackenzie's vitals were strong and stable. "Excellent work," Walker said. "Textbook abdominal repair. Where'd you learn that approach to the intestinal tear?" "Berlin. Professor Sauerbruch taught a technique for minimizing contamination." "Smart. I'll remember that." Walker began the closing. "You know what the difference is between you operating here and you operating in Caen?" "Resources." "Resources," Walker confirmed. "You're the same surgeon, same hands, same brain, same training. But here you've got the tools to actually use what you know. That's not about German versus American. That's about supply chain versus shortage." It was meant as reassurance, but it cut deeper than criticism. Bergman had been trained at one of the world's finest medical schools. He had the knowledge, the skill, the dedication. But his system had failed to provide him the basic resources necessary to apply that knowledge effectively. Private Mackenzie survived. He spent 2 weeks in recovery, was evacuated to England, and eventually returned to Virginia with scars and stories. Another life saved that would have been lost in Caen. August 12, 1944. Breaking point. Oberfeldarzt Heinrich Brandt, the internist, died of a heart attack at age 63. He collapsed during a routine medical examination, was immediately treated by American cardiologists, but couldn't be saved. The Americans conducted a full autopsy, with permission from the surviving German medical officers, determined the cause of death was acute myocardial infarction, and arranged a military funeral with full honors. The funeral was small but dignified. 15 German POW medical personnel, 20 American medical officers, a chaplain, an honor guard. Brandt was buried in a cemetery near Caen, his grave marked with a simple cross bearing his name, rank, and dates. Colonel Morrison spoke at the service. Heinrich Brandt was a healer. He served his nation, yes. But more importantly, he served the oath he took when he became a physician. In this hospital, he saved lives without regard to nationality. That is the highest calling of our profession. May he rest in peace. After the service, the German doctors stood together at the graveside. Brandt had been their elder, their conscience, the one who had articulated what they all felt but couldn't say. "He told me something the day before he died," Richter said quietly. "He said he was grateful for the heart attack, that it meant he wouldn't have to return to Germany and face what we've become." The words hung in the humid August air. "I used to think," Holzer said, his voice shaking, "that our defeats were military, that we lost battles, lost territory, but retained our essential superiority. Now I understand. We lost something more fundamental. We lost the right to believe we were special." "We were special," Bergman countered. "German medicine was extraordinary. German science changed the world." "Was," past tense. Holzer gestured toward the American hospital visible beyond the cemetery. "What we're watching here, this isn't the temporary success of a wealthy nation. This is systematic institutional excellence. They didn't get lucky. They planned, they organized, they built redundancy into every system, and we dismissed them as provincial merchants while we starved our own wounded of basic supplies." No one argued. The evidence was too overwhelming. September 8, 1944, transfer orders. The 447th Mobile Hospital was being moved forward following the Allied advance toward Germany. The German POW medical personnel were being transferred to a permanent POW camp in England. Bergman had been in American custody for 83 days. 83 days of confronting the gap between ideology and reality. 83 days of watching a system function that he'd been taught was impossible. Before departure, Colonel Morrison called the German doctors together for a final meeting. "Gentlemen, you've been valuable members of our medical team. You've saved lives, American lives, German lives, French civilian lives. That matters. War doesn't erase the good you've done here." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what happens when this war ends. I don't know what Germany will look like or what your role will be in rebuilding it. But I'll tell you what I hope. I hope you remember what you learned here. Not about American superiority. I'm not interested in that propaganda. But about what's possible when a medical system is properly resourced and systematically organized. If you return to medicine after the war, take these lessons with you. Build systems that prioritize sustainability over showcase. Invest in logistics as heavily as you invest in training. Remember that the measure of a medical system isn't how impressive it looks in peacetime, but how many lives it saves in crisis." Morrison extended his hand to Bergman. "Good luck, Doctor. I hope we meet again in better circumstances." Bergman shook his hand. "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." England. POW camp. October 1944, May 1945. The POW camp was in Lancashire, a former military training facility converted to house German prisoners. Conditions were adequate: barracks, regular food, medical facilities, access to Red Cross packages. The German medical officers were housed separately from regular prisoners and allowed to establish a small clinic for treating other POWs. Bergman spent his imprisonment reading. The camp library had limited medical texts, but it had American and British newspapers. He followed the war's progression: the failed Ardennes offensive, the crossing of the Rhine, the collapse of German resistance. In February 1945, he received a letter from the Red Cross. Anna was alive, living with her sister in Hamburg. The house they'd lived in had been destroyed in the July 1943 firebombing. She was working as a nurse in a civilian hospital, treating wounded and sick in conditions of desperate scarcity. He wrote back immediately. "My darling Anna, thank God you are alive. I have been praying for your safety every day. I cannot describe the conditions I've witnessed in American medical facilities, except to say that when this war ends, we must rebuild everything, not repair, rebuild. Our medical system was built on false assumptions and ideological conceits. The Americans have shown me what is possible when a nation prioritizes systematic organization over propaganda. I know this sounds like defeatism or collaboration. It is neither. It is the bitter acknowledgement that we were wrong. Not wrong to be proud of German science. Our achievements were real. Wrong to assume that historical success guaranteed present superiority. Wrong to allow ideology to override practical necessity. When I return home, and I pray that is soon, we will face difficult years. But perhaps, in the ruins, we can build something better. I love you eternally. Klaus May, 12, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war in Europe ended. Bergman heard the news in the camp mess hall, a British officer reading the official announcement. The German prisoners received the information in silence. No celebration, no despair, just exhaustion. Repatriation would take months. Bergman was classified as Category 3, professional personnel with no record of war crimes, eligible for early return. But early still meant waiting until transportation and processing could be arranged. He used the time to write a detailed memoir of his experiences in the American Field Hospital. 57 pages, written in careful longhand, documenting every technical detail he could remember: the triage system, the supply chain logistics, the specialization of surgical teams, the emphasis on sterility and infection prevention. He titled it Observations on American Military Medical Practice, July-August 1944, Lessons for Reconstruction. It was not a confession of defeat. It was a blueprint for rebuilding. Hamburg, Germany, January 1946. Bergman returned to a city he barely recognized. Hamburg had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Entire neighborhoods were rubble. The medical infrastructure was in ruins. Hospitals bombed, equipment destroyed or looted, supplies virtually non-existent. Anna met him at the train station. She was thinner, older, harder. worn down by 2 years of nursing in impossible conditions. They held each other in silence, too many emotions to articulate. That night in a small apartment they shared with Anna's sister and her 2 children, Bergman told his wife everything about the American hospital, about the autoclaves and the plasma and the surgical lights, about watching enemy doctors save lives he would have been forced to abandon. Were we wrong about everything? Anna asked quietly. Not everything. German medical science is still extraordinary. But we were wrong about organization, wrong about priorities, wrong about the relationship between ideology and practical effectiveness. He showed her his memoir. I've been thinking about how to rebuild, not restore what we had, but create something new. University of Hamburg, 1947-1950. The medical school reopened in stages. Bergman was hired as a lecturer in surgery, one of dozens of doctors trying to rebuild German medical education from the wreckage. He taught differently now. Yes, he covered surgical technique and anatomy and pathology, but he also taught systems thinking. He lectured on the importance of supply chain logistics. He brought in guest speakers from the British and American occupation authorities to discuss their medical organization. His courses were controversial. Some students, especially older students who had served in the Wehrmacht, accused him of defeatism, of elevating enemy practices over German tradition. I am not defeatist, Bergman replied in one heated classroom debate. I am realistic. German surgeons were and are among the finest in the world. But fine surgeons cannot save lives without proper equipment, without reliable supplies, without systematic support. We learned this lesson at catastrophic cost. Would you prefer we ignore what we learned and repeat our mistakes? Gradually, his approach gained acceptance. The younger students, especially, understood that rebuilding required honest assessment of past failures. Berlin, 1952, first post-war conference of German military medicine. The conference brought together surviving Wehrmacht medical officers to discuss lessons learned and strategies for the future. Bergman presented his memoir, expanded now into a comprehensive analysis of comparative military medical systems. The response was mixed. Some attendees praised his honesty and systematic approach. Others saw it as surrender to the victor's narrative. During a break, Ernst Richter, his fellow prisoner from the American hospital, approached him. Still fighting the good fight? Richter asked with a tired smile. Trying to. You? Teaching at Heidelberg, same battles. Students who want to believe we were merely unlucky rather than systematically outmatched. Richter lowered his voice. Have you seen the statistics? East Germany is trying to rebuild their medical system based on Soviet models. Same problems we had. Ideological rigidity, propaganda over functionality. They're going to repeat every mistake we made. And West Germany? Better. The Americans and British are helping us rebuild with emphasis on systematic organization. We're implementing triage protocols similar to what we saw in Normandy, investing in logistics, prioritizing sustainable practice over showcase facilities. Richter paused. It's humiliating, accepting help from our former enemies. But it's working. Humiliation is temporary. Dead patients are permanent. That should be the motto of modern medicine. Hamburg, 1957. Bergman was 55 years old, director of surgery at a rebuilt Hamburg hospital. The facility was modern, well-equipped, organized along principles he'd learned in that American field hospital 13 years earlier. He received a letter from America. The return address, Colonel Richard Morrison, retired, Baltimore, Maryland. Dear Dr. Bergman, I hope this letter finds you well. I am retired from the Army Medical Corps and working at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I recently attended a conference where a colleague mentioned your work on military medical systems in post-war Germany. I was pleased, though not surprised, to learn you had continued in medicine. I wanted to reach out because I've often thought about our collaboration in Normandy. Those were strange times, enemies working together to save lives. But I believe we demonstrated something important, that medical ethics transcend political conflict. I also wanted to tell you that several of the soldiers you operated on, both American and German, survived the war and have lived full lives. Private Thomas Mackenzie, whom you operated on in August 1944, is now a teacher in Virginia with 3 children. Underofficer Paul Schmidt returned to Hamburg and works as an engineer. The vascular repair you assisted on saved his leg and, arguably, his life. These are small victories in a war that produced massive tragedies. But they matter. If you are ever in the United States, I would be honored to show you Johns Hopkins and discuss medical practice. I believe we still have much to learn from each other. With respect and best wishes, Richard Morrison, M.D. Bergman, read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote his response. Dear Dr. Morrison, thank you for your letter. It arrived on a difficult day. Budget meetings, administrative conflicts, the usual frustrations of hospital management, and reminded me why I remain in this profession. I have never forgotten my time in your field hospital. Those months fundamentally changed how I understand medical practice. You and your colleagues taught me that systematic excellence is not a natural attribute of any nation or people, but a choice requiring constant effort and investment. I have spent the last 13 years trying to implement those lessons in German medical practice. It has been slow, frustrating work. Many of my colleagues resent learning from our former enemies. But gradually, we are building a medical system that prioritizes outcomes over ideology. Thank you for telling me about Mackenzie and Schmidt. Knowing they survived, that our work in that tent city in Normandy produced lasting human good, gives meaning to what was otherwise a period of profound defeat and revelation. I would be honored to visit Johns Hopkins someday. Until then, I remain grateful for your professionalism and humanity during the darkest period of my life. With respect and admiration, Klaus Bergman, M.D. Hamburg, 1975. Klaus Bergman died of lung cancer at age 73. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, former students, colleagues, patients whose lives he had saved over 4 decades of surgical practice. His memoir, Observations on American Military Medical Practice, had been published in 1968 by a German medical press. It sold modestly, but became required reading in several German medical schools. The title that students knew it by was different from the official one. They called it The Confession, referencing Bergman's famous admission. Es ist schlimmer für uns im Hinterland. The book's final chapter, written in 1967, reflected on his experiences. I was raised to believe in German superiority. This belief was not entirely false. German science had achieved genuine excellence, but it was incomplete and ultimately destructive. We confused historical achievement with permanent status. We assumed that past success guaranteed present capability. The Americans taught me a hard lesson. Superiority must be earned continuously through systematic effort, honest self-assessment, and the willingness to adapt. They did not defeat us merely through greater resources, though resources mattered. They defeated us through superior organization, through choosing sustainability over spectacle, through building redundancy rather than relying on ideology. The confession that broke me in 1944, that American field hospitals were better than our permanent facilities, was not a surrender to enemy propaganda. It was an acknowledgement of observable reality. And acknowledgement is the prerequisite for improvement. I spent my career trying to implement American organizational principles in German medical practice, not because American methods were inherently superior, but because they worked. They saved lives. And saving lives is the only metric that matters. To the generation of German doctors who came after the war, do not make our mistakes. Do not confuse nationalist pride with professional excellence. Do not allow ideology to override evidence. Build systems that work, regardless of where the ideas originated. Medicine is a human profession serving human needs. That truth transcends nations, transcends wars, transcends the temporary political arrangements that divide us. Learn from everyone. Acknowledge reality even when it contradicts your training. And remember, the measure of a medical system is not how impressive it looks, but how many lives it saves. Baltimore, Maryland, 1975. Richard Morrison, retired and teaching medical ethics at Johns Hopkins, read Bergman's obituary in a German medical journal. He sat in his office for a long moment remembering that field hospital in Normandy, The German doctors working alongside Americans, the shared purpose despite being enemies, the strange dignity of professional collaboration in the middle of war. He wrote a letter to Anna Bergman, expressing condolences and recounting his memories of Klaus's work in the American hospital. He described the lives that had been saved, the professionalism that had persisted despite everything, the human connection that transcended conflict. The letter concluded, "Your husband taught me something important about the nature of defeat and growth. He could have remained rigid in his ideology, dismissed American practices as enemy propaganda, protected his pride by denying evidence. Instead, he chose the harder path, acknowledging that he had been wrong, learning from his enemies, and dedicating his remaining career to improving his nation's medical practice based on those painful lessons. That is true courage, not the courage of fighting without questioning, but the courage of questioning what you've been taught and changing based on what you discover. Klaus Bergman was a good doctor, a good man, and a worthy colleague. The world is poorer for his loss." Hamburg, 1985. The Hamburg University Medical Center dedicated its new surgical wing in honor of Klaus Bergman. The dedication ceremony included a speech by Professor Dr. Margareta Schultz, Director of Surgery, who had been Bergman's student in the 1950s. Professor Bergman taught us that medical excellence requires humility, not false modesty, but genuine humility, the willingness to acknowledge when others do things better than we do, and the courage to learn from them. This was a radical lesson for Germany in the post-war years. We were a defeated nation struggling to rebuild, tempted to cling to past glories and deny present realities. Professor Bergman showed us a different path: honest assessment, systematic learning, practical improvement. The surgical techniques we practice here, the organizational systems that make this hospital function, the emphasis on logistics and sustainability. All of this reflects lessons Professor Bergman learned as a prisoner of war and spent his career implementing. His confession, "It's worse for us in the rear," began as an admission of defeat, but it became a foundation for reconstruction. That is his legacy, the understanding that acknowledging failure is not weakness, but the prerequisite for improvement. The new wing incorporated every organizational principle Bergman had advocated: robust supply chain systems, specialized surgical teams, emphasis on sterility and infection control, systematic triage protocols. It was built not as a showcase, but as a functional system designed to save lives efficiently and sustainably. In a small glass case in the wing's entrance hall, Bergman's original 1945 memoir was displayed, open to the final page. "We were not wrong to be proud. We were wrong to stop questioning. Pride without humility leads to stagnation. Excellence requires constant learning, even from enemies, even from defeat. This is my confession and my hope for the future.